everybody. Okay. There we go. Let's get started. I'd like to begin tonight with the following land acknowledgement. The University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish people of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. Good evening, and welcome to tonight's first public lecture of the academic year. So we're very excited to see you. I know, and applaud yourselves for coming out of your homes. It's a big deal, right? It's kind of a big deal. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Yvette Moy, and I am the director of the Office of Public Lectures that's housed here at the university, and we live in the graduate school. Before we begin tonight, we have a few housekeeping items to run through with you. If you haven't done so already, please take your cell phones out and silence them. We ask that you please refrain from video or audio recording tonight's lecture. We are recording it, and the video will be made available within about 24 to 48 hours post-lecture on our YouTube page. We ask that you also please refrain from taking photographs of our speaker while they're up at the podium, because it's very distracting. And then finally, if you have any questions for tonight's speaker, we have 2 IO microphones for you, but we also have an option for you to email your questions in to mayiask@uw.edu, and we'll be able to capture your questions and share them with our speaker. I have a few people to thank this evening, specifically some staff from the University of Washington who stayed really late to help us get this event off the ground. So I want to acknowledge Sam and Jolynn for the extra time that they spent with us to support us. So a little applause for them. Thank you so much. And then finally, Dr. Ann Morning is our guest, and she will be introduced by UW faculty member and UW professor of communication, Dr. Leilani Nishimi.
All right, thank you, Yvette. So, as Yvette said, I'm Leilani Nishime, and today I'm here to introduce Dr. Ann Morning. Dr. Morning is a professor of sociology at New York University and a member of NYU Abu Dhabi's affiliated faculty. Trained in demography, her research focuses on race, ethnicity, and the sociology of science, especially as they pertain to census classification worldwide and to individuals' concepts of difference. She's the author of The Nature of Race, How Scientists Think and Teach About Human Difference, and the first author of An Ugly Word, Rethinking Race in Italy and the United States. Professor Morning was a 2008 and 2009 Fulbright Research Fellow at the University of Milan Bicocca, a 2014-15 visiting scholar at the Russell Sage Foundation, and a 2019 visiting professor at Institut d'études politiques in Paris. She was a member of the US Census Bureau's National Advisory Committee on Racial, Ethnic, and Other Populations from 2013 to 2019, and has consulted on ethno-racial statistics for the European Commission, the United Nations, the World Bank Group, and Elsevier. She is currently a member of the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine Committee on the use of race, ethnicity, and ancestry as population descriptions in genomic research. Dr. Morning holds her BA in Economics from Political Science, magna cum laude from Yale University, a Master's of International Affairs from Columbia University, and a PhD in Sociology from Princeton University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ann Morning.
Okay, thank you so much, Megan. Thank you all so much for being here. Let me just ask if someone knows how I can get rid of this little box on my screen before I get started. That easy. Fantastic. I'd like to start off, first of all, by thanking all of you for being here. It's just terrific to see you here, and I'm also so grateful to the University of Washington for having brought me here this week. Now, I think that everyone, let me see if my, Excuse me 1 second. Let me find another way to do this. There we go. Thank you. All right, I think that all of us can agree pretty readily that race has been a major feature of public conversation in the United States over the last couple of years. And I'm sure we can all think of countless examples. I put up here on the screen just a couple. Of course, the Black Lives Matter movement has been a mainstay of our conversation as a nation. And of course, in the last couple of years, the differential toll of COVID-19 across racial groups has been also a feature of our national life that we've talked about. Now, of course, this is not new to the United States. Race has always been a major feature of our public conversations in this nation. And we can think about from the episodes, the eras of slavery, discussion and debate around abolition, immigration and exclusionary measures, territorial expansion and annexation, the civil rights movement, the list goes on and on. But tonight, I'd like to invite you to think about ways in which we don't talk about race as a nation very often, the ways in which it operates under the surface and shapes events in ways that don't often make our headlines. Now, as a sociologist, I specialize actually in these unexamined aspects of race. For 20 years, I have studied what is really a little examined aspect of race in our nation, and that is simply the ways in which we define it, the ways in which we understand it. And that's what I call racial conceptualization, which was the topic of my first book, The Nature of Race. And I'm going to argue that these understandings that we have, these beliefs that we have about what race is, really underpin the inequalities and the injustices that have featured so prominently in our national conversation about race. So what do I mean by racial conceptualization? Well, I think of it as a complex of beliefs, as really a working model, the working model that we all carry around in our heads about how race works, what it is. It includes the things that we believe, not simply about what race is, our definitions of it, but our ideas about things like how many races there are in the world. How do we know who belongs to one race or another? How do we think race, where do we think they came from, races, and what do we believe demarcates or distinguishes one race from another? Now, in my research in the United States, I've found there to be roughly or largely three main concepts of race that we Americans seem to carry around in our heads. One, and probably the most widespread, is the long-standing traditional biological concept of race. That is the notion that what races are groups of people that share some biological, some physical trait or set of traits. That's the idea of race, the oldest idea of race that comes to us from the 18th century, right? From the traditional taxonomies of Linnaeus, Blumenbach, and others. I also find, though, in my research in the United States, the circulation of a concept of race that we can call a cultural concept. This is the claim that what racial groups actually are groups of people who share some cultural characteristics in common. They may share particular world outlooks, particular traditional practices, food ways, dress, matters of ways of speaking, and so forth. Those would constitute a cultural concept or notion of race. And the third that I want to talk about most tonight is actually probably the least widespread concept of race that circulates in the United States today, and that is the idea of race as a social construction. Right? And this, I'm going to talk about this more in a minute, but this is simply the idea that races are not kind of natural or objective groupings of people that share some particular characteristic or set of characteristics, but rather they're groups of people that are lumped together in a sense by our social rules, our social conventions, and that depend on our subjective assessments of similarity and difference, who is like whom, who is different from whom. Now, constructivism is actually the concept that does the best job of uniting what we actually know about patterns of human biological variation, and what we know about the history of the creation of racial categories. And yet, as I said, it's probably the least widespread of our ways of thinking about race in the United States today. So in my talk today, I'm going to be focusing on the question, why hasn't the constructivist concept of race made greater inroads in the United States? Now, before I sort of get into the ideas that I want to share with you about that question, I want to delve more into the concept of race as a social construct, because a lot of people are familiar with that phrase. How many of you have heard that phrase? Raise your hand. Race is a social construct, right? I see a majority of people in the audience are familiar with that phrase. But what I find in my research is that people have often heard it, may even believe it, but yet don't have a very deep grasp of what that means. So I want to just spend a couple of minutes talking about what I understand that to mean and how I'll be using that in this talk. So I'm going to start with a definition that comes to us from the American Sociological Association, which defines race as a social invention. So that's where we get that idea of social construction. And they stress that race it's an idea, it's a construct that changes according to the historical context, to the political and social moment. And I want to build on the ASA definition of race to stress two aspects of it. That race is indeed a social invention. It's a system of classification that we human beings have invented. And it's grounded in our subjective assessments, our subjective beliefs about similarity and difference, it's grounded in our subjective calculus of similarity and difference. Now, to start with the first point, thinking about race as a socially invented system of classification, I'm taking you here to a US biology textbook from the 1950s. Here's a classification that you might have seen if you were taking biology at that time. And this is clearly a classificatory system. It's a taxonomy of human beings. And it has a couple of things that are typical of its moment, that this is not what you would see in a textbook today. You would see other kinds of taxonomies. But what we see in this classification system from the 1950s is a couple of things. First of all, we see that there are many races. In this depiction, there are 10 races. They are arrayed in a clear hierarchical order. It is no accident that the Caucasian race stands at the top and the Ethiopian race at the bottom. Clothing, right? Traditional or cultural practices are also embedded in this. Clothing or lack of clothing is part of how we recognize or know races in this depiction. But ultimately, it's also grounded in a belief about biological difference between these races, right? Hence its prominence in a biology textbook. Now, what I want to underscore is that race is just one of many classification systems that we human beings have invented to make sense of human diversity. And we can pair it alongside another such system, which is astrology, right? This is also a system that classifies human beings into several categories, comparable number of categories. Astrology also purports to tell us something about different types of people, including their appearance and their behaviors and their outcomes. And also, like race, it's a system of classifying people that's based on a naturalistic argument, on the claims that there are objective natural forces out there that are shaping us in our outcomes. So in the race model, in that concept, the idea is that it's our blood or our genes that are dictating who we are, our capacities, our behaviors. In astrology, the natural mechanism is ostensibly the position of the sun, moon, and stars that leave an imprint upon us at the moment of our birth. And again, this natural mechanism is supposed to tell us something about who we are, the kinds of people we are, and the outcomes. So hopefully pairing these two things, juxtaposing them, helps you understand what it means to say that race is socially constructed. It's something we've invented, a system that we've invented for making sense of human diversity. Now, the second aspect of race that I stressed was that it involves a calculus of similarity and difference. But locating racial boundaries, drawing lines between who is similar, who is different in the human species is a little bit like trying to draw a line or boundaries on a rainbow or a light spectrum. Because variation in our species, particularly biological variation, is something that changes, it moves very gradually across space. If you think, for example, about how human beings differ by skin color across the world, right? We don't see places in the world where you have people with very light skin all grouped together next to people with very dark skin. If we sort of look across people's origins across the globe, we see that skin color, like other human characteristics like blood type and all kinds of human biological features, they change gradually in space. And so coming up with a measure of where the boundaries are that demarcate who is like whom and who is different from whom always involves this subjective process of drawing boundaries, much as if we were to try to find the right places in the light spectrum to draw objective lines. Now, the interesting thing, taking this metaphor of the rainbow, is that we can, in fact, if we want, put a line somewhere, anywhere, in this expanse of gradual difference. And of course, once we put the line there, once we make up two groups, however we see fit, these two groups will, in fact, differ from each other on average. So if I were to take the rainbow as a stand-in for skin color, we could say that I could put a line right in the middle and say that, you know, to the left, you do have people who have more blue skin, and to the right, you have people who have more orange skin, right? It would seem then, once we had these two different groups, that we must have really stumbled onto some meaningful difference. These are different groups. But of course, we could have put the lines somewhere else. We could have decided instead that there are three groups. We could have put the lines wherever we felt, and again, come away convinced that we had uncovered some reality of starkly different, objectively different groups. Now, this is what has happened with the race concept, and particularly for us in the United States. We can think about how our notions of racial difference have really been supported by the fact that that North America has been populated by groups of people coming from different corners of the globe, places that were somewhat geographically distant from each other. So we brought together people with different appearances. And once we brought them here and noticed their differences, it was as if we had discovered the proof that there existed out in the world objectively 3 or 4 or 5 races, or maybe 10 races, according to our 1950s biology textbook. So when we say that race is socially constructed, we are pointing to the fact that even though once we've produced these races, they seem to us to be real, to be objective and natural realities, that in fact what seems so real to us, so natural to us, is the product of the lines, the groupings that we have made. Now, I said also at the outset that this notion of race as socially constructed wasn't widespread in the United States, that it was, we could say, a minority opinion. So I'm going to explore in this talk why I say that. Why do I say that it's something of a minority opinion? But I'm going to tell you where I started off with this sense, and that was with interviews that I conducted with college students in the Northeast of the United States in the early 2000s. When I asked my sample of over 50 undergraduate students in the Northeast to define the term race, I found that the most popular way for them to talk about race was to cast it as a matter of cultural difference. So again, coming back to that cultural concept of race, as this person said, race had to do with the culture that you're coming from, you're different, it has to do with how you eat, what you wear, and so forth. Now, kind of a close second, and another concept of race that people often combined with the cultural approach, was to simply say, to use the kind of old and traditional notion of races as as a matter of distinct biological groupings. So those were popular ways among the students I interviewed to talk about race. The constructivist notion of race was kind of a distant third, less than a fifth of the students that I happened to interview embraced or really accepted and grasped that notion of human difference. And it's striking because probably we would imagine that it would be a college-educated sample like this where we would get the highest rate of Americans embracing the notion of race as socially constructed, right? That it's most likely an idea that people are getting precisely from their exposure to higher education. But even in this relatively highly educated sample, it was very much a minority opinion. Now, the other reason that I suggest that the constructivist notion of race is a minority view in the United States has to do with the fact that I repeatedly, in my years of research, I keep encountering certain domains where it's clear that we Americans are resistant to constructivist notions of race. And in particular, we continue to really strongly embrace a biological reading of what race is. This has been the case particularly in the realms of biological research, in debates about transracial identities, and also in talk about sports. So I'm going to talk about each of these in turn and take them all as case studies of places where the concept of race as socially constructed has hit a wall, basically. So I'll start first with the biological sciences. And it's really, I have to say, it's fascinating to explore concepts of race in biology and biological research, because biologists, and I will also include here physical anthropologists, like Ashley Montague here, who published Man's Most Dangerous Myth, The Fallacy of Race in 1942, these scientists have known and made clear since the mid-20th century that race doesn't, our concepts of race don't actually map onto what scientists know about human biological variation. So this argument has only grown stronger among biological scientists over the course of the late 20th century, and really, I would say, culminated with the sequencing, or the first draft sequencing of the human genome in 2000, which made it abundantly clear that our species doesn't come naturally clustered in 3 or 4 or 5 types, that the 8+ billion of us can't be neatly assigned to a handful of small groups. The 2000 sequencing of the genome, for one thing, revealed also just how much genetic similarity there is across all human beings, regardless of what racial categories we think they're in. And yet, racial categories continue today to find their way into genetic research, and particularly into biological research that is related to health outcomes. So I found that when I interviewed scientists who were biologists and anthropologists, just a few years after the sequencing of the human genome, so a few years after that 2000 ceremony at the White House, that just about 40% of the scientists I interviewed continued to maintain that racial groups were biological entities, that biology was what demarcated races, that biology was the key to understanding racial difference. Of the remaining 60%, they sort of adopted different kinds of arguments. Some were focused more on making biological arguments against the biological reality of race, and others were relying more on making constructivist arguments about how the socio-historical record shows us the flexibility, the social invention beyond our racial categories. But it's striking that even in an era where the findings of the human genome were so widely publicized to challenge traditional notions of race as biological entities, that such a large share of scientists would continue to embrace that notion. And I think that range of, we could say, clashing opinions, maybe we could also say confusion and uncertainty, still exists today in 2022. And so much so that the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine convened the committee that I'm now a part of to establish guidance on the uses of race, ethnicity, and ancestry in human genomics. So establish guidance for scientists working in this field. Now it is, again, kind of surprising that in a field where scientists have been so instrumental in helping us understand the disconnect between our traditional racial categories and human biological variation, it's striking that there would still be a need for such a committee, that there still would be as much confusion or conflicting opinion as there is. But I want to suggest that this notion of race is socially constructed hasn't made more headway in the biological sciences because it's been met with concerns about how race relates to, or how the extent to which race is necessary for us to deliver the appropriate health care that people need. So for many, race remains a useful tool for addressing inequalities in medicine. And there are different arguments that people make to this effect. So one is the traditional biological concept of race, the idea that different races have very different medical, biological needs, and so they are in need of distinct forms of treatment. So we've got to take race into account to account for those biological differences. Another way of thinking is that races differ in their cultural practices, again, harking back to the cultural concept of race. And so those different practices or norms or values, perhaps related to the seeking of healthcare, might make it necessary to take race into account when thinking about the treatment of patients. And then finally, for some, race is important to have included in our study of health outcomes because it can serve as a proxy of or a marker for people's life experiences, and particularly the extent to which they have to contend with discrimination and its effects on their health outcomes, on their access to health care, and so forth. Now, interestingly, even for any of these concerns, race is actually not the best tool that we could use to get at any of this information. We could genotype people to understand whether patients have particular genetic variants that are associated with a particular disease. So rather than guess it from their self-identified race, we could actually get more closely to the genetic information that would let us know something about their propensity for one condition or another. When it comes to cultural practices, we could ask people about their practices, for example, their dietary practices, their healthcare seeking practices, if we really wanted to understand what factors were at work in shaping their outcomes. And similarly, we could ask people about the environments that they inhabit, their experiences with discrimination, the environmental conditions of the neighborhoods in which they live, and so forth. So in a sense, race is a poor proxy for almost anything that we would want to know with respect to delivering quality healthcare. And yet, I think this association of race with medical care today, so this sort of new and benevolent depiction of race, has made it something of, it's given it staying power in the biological sciences because it's seen as turning a page or marking a departure from the clearly racist and dangerous ways in which scientific and particularly biological notions of race have been used in the past, right? It's no secret, of course, that scientists' theories about the sort of the natural inferiority of non-white racial groups served historically to underpin the most oppressive policies, whether we're talking about as an apology for an excuse rather, justification for slavery, for eugenics, for immigration exclusion, and of course the Holocaust, right? So there's no mystery there about the ways in which racial and biological racial theories of difference have been very, very dangerous tools. So the contemporary spin that race is now a force for good in healthcare, I think, is what has given it staying power in this field, that for many people, rethinking the ethical stakes of using or inserting race into the conversation about healthcare has given it a new acceptability. And this is something that I call the redemption of race today. As a result of this redemption, we see that the realm of medical care and broadly of genetic research, to the extent also that it is increasingly tied to how we think about delivering quality medical care, that it's proving to be a place where social constructivism is sort of at an impasse, is sort of meeting a certain wall. I'd like to shift now to the second of the case studies that I mentioned for an area in which I see social constructivism being somewhat stymied in its progress. And this has to do with debates in our country around transracial identities. Now, as some of you may remember, Washington State back in 2015 was the site for a media firestorm that erupted when local reporters in Spokane interviewed the head of the Spokane chapter of the NAACP, Rachel Dolezal, and asked her on camera about her racial identity. So Ms. Dolezal was born to white parents, but had come to identify herself as a Black woman. And because of that, she became the target of really nationwide and to some extent international scrutiny, ridicule, vitriol for her chosen identity. Now, although the media really focused the story on her decision about her identity, what is truly fascinating about this episode is us, is our reaction as members of the American public to the claims that she made and to the idea that the media developed. This was not her coining this idea, but the media applied to her the label transracial. So the idea that one might, again, trans race might cross racial boundaries. Now, what I'm going to stress here is that this episode is not interesting because of Rachel Dolezal. None of us knew her when this story erupted. And I have to say, in general, as a sociologist of race, I'm used to studying the complexities of people's racial self-identification, of understanding these can be difficult things, and frankly, also as a New Yorker, I'm inclined to think it's people's business, and not my place to judge people's decisions about their identity. But what is so powerful and important about this case is what it says about us and our concepts of race and racial difference that really came to the fore in this media episode. Now, as I said, I was, when this story broke, I was sort of surprised by, why would people across the country care about some random person's, racial identity? But I came to understand better over time how this case garnered so much attention because it was really the perfect storm of a multitude of anxieties and concerns and resentments about race, all of which this case tapped into. So, first of all, one of the motives for the public condemnation of Ms. Dolezal clearly came out of the suspicion that she was choosing to identify as Black for some material gain. Right? Now, as it turns out, people thought, for example, that she couldn't be the head of an NAACP chapter unless she was Black. Not true. People thought she was making money as the head of the chapter. She wasn't. It was an unpaid position. But I think more than the facts of what the material gain might have been here or there for her, what this anger was really tapping into was a much broader and deeper resentment in American life towards affirmative action policies and the ways in which the nation has adopted policies, of course, that are being chipped away at, but since the 1970s, has adopted policies which many Americans feel are illegitimate. Many Americans are opposed to affirmative action policies because they believe that it means that people are trading in on their racial self-identification for gains that are illegitimate. That is, to somehow expect something in return on the basis of one's racial identification is an utterly problematic, unacceptable thing to do for many Americans. And so the idea of someone who was apparently trading on a racial identity for gain really was triggering, I guess we could say, or rather I should say, it hit a deep nerve in American political life. But another important reason that it caused such an outcry was because it also tapped into another long simmering resentment, this time on the part of people of color, and particularly African Americans, right? A deeply felt resentment of ways in which African Americans' contributions to American life had been appropriated. So whether we're talking about cultural contributions or frankly just the appropriation of the physical labor of Black people in this country, that anger over the idea of Dolezal appropriating something from Black people by claiming a Black identity was also a real catalyst for a lot of the resentment and anger directed at her. But the last source of hostility towards her that I want to draw on, and that's most relevant, I think, to concepts of difference, had to do with the ways that many people felt that the notion of a transracial identity was a deeply offensive one, and that it was offensive to, particularly for people who identified, who had some kind of a trans identity themselves. This came out, first of all, from folks who understood themselves to be transracial adoptees. So the label transracial had been used previously most widely to apply to people who had been adopted into families of a different racial group than their own. But it also was seen as disrespectful of transgender identities. The idea, in a nutshell, was that to make a transracial claim was so ludicrous, it was so absurd, it was so crazy, that it could only somehow tarnish other kinds of trans identities. Now, this is what I want to zero in on. This belief that underpinned the debate that wasn't so often explicitly stated, but this notion that it was impossible for a person to change races, that it went against nature somehow, that it couldn't be done because it was biologically impossible. And this argument tips us off right away to the presence of very traditional biological notions of race, right? This is not a constructivist perspective on race. Asserting that we each have a race that is embedded in our bodies, that cannot be changed because it's a physical fact, is a deeply, deeply essentialist and biological concept of race. And so that is really what came to the fore so strongly in these debates about about transracial identities. If we were to take a constructivist view of this matter, what we would realize was that Dolezal's claim to Blackness wasn't a biological impossibility, right? Because race is not dictated by biology. But what it was socially unacceptable, right? So that was really, the nature of her offense, we could say, was not breaching the natural order of things, the order of biology, but it was disrupting and disregarding our deeply anchored social norms about how people should be identified by race. One other thing that's fascinating about this case is that as much as we claimed in these debates that to change one's race was impossible, that Dolezal was completely nuts, which was basically the prevailing argument, in fact, it's an empirical reality in our country that demographers led by Carolyn Liebler at the University of Minnesota found that nearly 10 million Americans have changed their race from one decade to the next. So she, with the demographers from the Census Bureau, looked at people's racial self-identification on the census between 2000 and 2010 and found that 9.7 million Americans changed their race, as Dolezal did. So what's striking is that even though we're in the midst of evidence, right, and we also know from our historical past about passing, there are all kinds of ways in which we actually have the evidence around us that our racial categories are malleable. And yet, in this debate, it revealed how deeply that we continue to want to think about races as biologically fixed and anchored in our bodies. Now, on that note, I'm going to come to the last arena where I see the socially constructed notion of race, or the notion of race as socially constructed, really having a hard time progressing. And that comes to the domain of sports, the ways that people think and talk about sports. And I'll be the first to admit, I'm not a sociologist of sport. I am not knowledgeable about sport. So really, this is something that I really stumbled onto, that I learned in the course of my research. So this is something that emerged in interviews that I've conducted both in the United States and Italy, and in my brand new book that just came out this summer, An Ugly Word, Rethinking Race in Italy and the United States. In the work that I did with that with my co-author, Marcello Maneri, it became very clear that on either side of the Atlantic, when the topic turned to sport, that people turned immediately to very deeply held biological notions of racial difference. And in particular, what came across again and again was what I've called Black biological exceptionalism. The idea that Black people, and Black people alone, have special physical characteristics which determine their performance on the sports field. So what we found in talking with young people, both in Italy and in the United States, was basically three things that they believed, three beliefs that they held in common, which was very striking to me because Italy and the United States are pretty different societies, certainly when it comes to their racial makeup, right? Italy has a small share of the population that's Black. It has a smaller share of the population that's foreign-born compared to the United States. There are a lot of things about it that are different, and yet we heard exactly the same stories about sports and the Black body on either side of the Atlantic. So what did we hear? Basically three things. So first of all, we heard, when we asked students to, our interviews, to talk about different sports, when they spoke about sports in which people of African descent were disproportionately represented, so think, for example, here in this country of the NFL, where Black players make up a larger share of the NFL athletes than they do in the US population at large. Similarly, white players make up a smaller percentage of the NFL than they do in the population at large. So if we look at that kind of basically demographic imbalance, how do we explain that? That was a question we put to our interviewees. And what we found time and again in the US, in Italy, was that this could be explained because Black people had special physical traits, usually described as having to do with muscles, that allowed them to excel in a given sport. Now, the second thing that we found out was when we asked students to talk about sports in which people of European descent predominated, think swimming, think ice hockey, then we never heard Americans or Italians say that white people had special physical traits that allowed them to excel in those sports. Hence the Black biological exceptionalism. Only Black people's outcomes could be explained according to their bodies. For whites or for other groups, had nothing to do with their bodies. European athletes just trained harder. They were more dedicated to their sports. That's how they became such good swimmers. It was part of their culture. Ice hockey was really important to them culturally. Any excuse, or I should say, any concept of difference other than a biological one was what would be applied to any other group of athletes. And then finally, the third commonality that we found between both countries was that our interviews in both places had exactly the same backstory for why it would be that Blacks would have special physical characteristics, but nobody else did. And the backstory went like this. African Americans, people of African descent, their ancestors in Africa, to deal with the difficulties, the challenges of their natural environment, had to develop certain muscles, certain physical skills. The classic story, Africans had to run away from lions, they had to chase down cheetahs for their dinner, they had to become very fast to survive in that environment. So they developed their physical capacities. Now, Europeans, now, did Europeans come to become good hockey players because in the ice ages they had to skate across the ice chased by woolly mammoths? No, not at all. Europeans, according to this story, dealt with the harshness of their environments by developing their mental faculties, their intellectual capacities. So here we are today. We understand sports as the terrain where we see the results of millennia of human evolution, where somehow explicably one group of people, Africans, developed their muscles and Europeans developed their intellectual abilities. Now, what was so striking about this is that the story was exactly the same in the US as in Italy. Again, Italy, country with a pretty negligible Black population, but the same stories were being circulated. And what I saw in both places was that these accounts of human difference had an intensely, almost intimate quality to them. These were stories that people kept telling us they heard from their family. They were jokes that people told at the dinner table. Their coaches told them about this. They talked about it with their friends. So these were ideas that were circulating in everyday life, and for some reason, people thought important to share with each other, to circulate, to keep these, what are essentially colonial era stories alive. So I want to suggest that for that reason, that it's probably in this domain of sports that the notion of race as such socially constructed has the greatest uphill battle to go. If I think about the ways in which notions of race, concepts of race are being debated, for example, in the first case I took, biological sciences, we see movement, we see ferment, we see debate happening. We see a committee now of us assigned to write something hopefully helpful that will help other scientists think about this. That's in movement. It's not so solidified. In the case of the debates about transracial identities, also, that's a debate which, in a sense, it's in its infancy. We're going to see future iterations of this as we see other people making transracial claims. It's not yet set in stone. It's not gelled. We'll see where that goes. But the sports ideas, these are ideas, again, as I said, they have a colonial legacy. They have a root in slavery, right? The association of the Black body with labor, with physical exertion comes to us from that era. And the fact that it is being, frankly, so lovingly preserved, I think that's the phrase that comes to mind for me, that people, when they spoke about sports and racial difference, were unburdened, that they spoke about race freely and with eagerness and in lighthearted ways. They enjoyed the jokes about Africans chasing lions or being chased by lions. There was, I'm going to say, an almost tender affection for these stories that tell me that they're deeply rooted in a way that will make them very hard to dislodge. So that brings me to my conclusion. So the last couple of remarks that I want to make. So I want to suggest that although there are different reasons that social constructivism is facing something of an uphill battle in these different domains I've spoken about, there's an underlying theme that joins them all, and that is that our socialization as young people into concepts of race underpin our reluctance to adopt new thinking about race in any of these domains. That is, until social constructivism becomes a way of talking about race that we learn as children in our families, from our friends, from our coaches and religious authorities, and certainly from our teachers in school, until that happens, social constructivism is going to continue to have a hard time of making inroads in our country, no matter how well it aligns with our growing knowledge of the complexities of the human genome, or our greater knowledge of the socio-historical record and all the evidence of the ways in which we've created these categories. Now, for the very last slide, I want to just ask the so what question. Why does it matter? Why does it matter how people understand race, how they define it? Why does it matter how they conceptualize it? And I should have said before, here I'm showing you more pages from old biology textbooks from the 1950s. So It matters because the ways in which we understand racial difference, the extent to which we think about it as a matter of biology or culture or social rules, has everything to do with how we understand the nature of racial inequalities and injustices, and it shapes the steps that we take to eradicate those. As long as we think that races are fundamentally biological subspecies, that they are different types of biological creature altogether, we're going to look at all the inequalities in our society as the results of these inbred physical differences. We're going to look at differences in educational attainment, at differences in wealth, at differences in life expectancy. We're going to look at all of those things and want to explain them by referring to just the natural tendencies of peoples who inhabit different racial bodies. So it's important to get a better, more precise understanding of how these inequalities are produced, how they're socially engineered, how we create them as a society. We need a tool, an approach to understanding race, a concept of race that is up to that job, that really allows us to see the ways in which we, as a society, engineer those differences. It's the only way in which we'll ever have the tools to really satisfactorily and deeply address those inequalities. So I'm going to end on that note, but I want to thank you all so much for your attention, and I'm very much looking forward to any questions or comments that you have. So thank you. So I think that we are taking some questions online, but I'm also happy to take any questions here in the audience. If you just raise your hand if you have a question.
Oh, I can walk over. Okay. This may not be so much directly with your talk, but I was sitting here thinking, how do the concepts you're working with here flow into gender identity?
So I think that the common thread here is that we can also think about gender identities as socially constructed, right? Racial groupings are not the only things that we construct socially. So for me, that would be the link.
Okay. Yeah, because I'm thinking of every HR department in the country with their fill in the blank on your race, on your gender, and this kind of thing, and how do we change that?
Well, it's interesting because, again, the debate is about whether we need to recognize these identities and categories in order to combat discrimination on the basis of them. And so there are ways in which we may well want to use those categories to recognize different experiences that people have. And then there are other ways in which we may think that we can gather even better data or more precise data that gets more directly to forms of discrimination or exclusion that people feel. Thank you for your question. Please, yeah, I guess I'll ask, people should come to the microphone, is that it? Or?
Possible.
Sorry
so
to...
everyone can hear.
Okay.
Good evening, and thank you for allowing me to come here and be here. My question is to the data that you collected on the Rachel Dolezal.
Yeah.
When that happened, and I'm a product of the South, and a lot of my family members went to HBCUs, okay, a lot of the women. And when that came out, I moved out here to Seattle, and I would frequently go back home. And when I would go back home to Charlotte, and it was like, why are you up in the Pacific Northwest when everyone is here? And then I was actually home when that news broke out.
Yeah.
So being, like, my family back home is prominent in political figures in Charlotte, and they were asking me, how could that happen? It wasn't because she was the head of the NAACP, which anyone could hold that position, is that how could she, identify herself as transracial, whereas, I had friends when the 2000 census came out, that, you know, from 10 years of what we call a musical reckoning in the urban community from the early 90s, late 80s, up into the 2000s, where a lot of people were getting their information through music and through rap music, through various artists. And then when they would see with this, you know, the incident with Rachel, how was she able to, you know, say as transracial when someone back home, I had a lot of, you know, women that were friends that had master's degrees and things of that nature, and they said they couldn't, if they tried that, they would be ridiculed and they would never, ever be able to be accepted in that position. So, I mean, I have family members that are Deltas, AKAs, you know, Zeta, and, you know, a lot of them had a lot of resentment and they felt that they were pushed backwards. But a lot of them haven't, you know, had the freedom of coming out the Pacific Northwest, where life is a little different, okay? And I just want to know if your data was, you know, constructively just captive, or was it in regionals? Because individuals think differently in regions, okay? Southerners think different than deep Southerners, Northeasterners, you know, versus Midwestern, and, you know, out here in the West and the Southern West. That was my question, because I had a lot of family members, you know, and friends, college friends, you know, that they felt a lot of resentment that she did that, you know.
Yeah, thank you. So you've touched on a lot of things. I'm going to see if I can draw these strands together. So about sort of regional differences. One of the things that was so interesting about the Dolezal case was that it commanded national attention, and it was also picked up in news outlets overseas. So I would argue that there was actually, between national news coverage and also just sort of the social media, that there was a national conversation about this. Now, there were definitely, we could say, sort of variants or different different pockets of different objections to her that I kind of tried to capture here, that not everybody was upset with her for the same reason. There were different reasons that people had for being upset with her. But interestingly, I interviewed her for the American Sociological Association's, we have a magazine called Context, and I interviewed her for that. And one of the things I asked her was, you know, is there any particular group of people that you find is most supportive or most upset with you? And she mentioned specifically Black women as being at the two extremes, that certainly there were lots of Black women, I think, sharing the reaction that you're describing, right, of being angry. But she also said some Black women are also among my greatest supporters. And some of you may recall that Rihanna came out kind of in support of her, or at least refraining from condemning her. But I also want to touch on another question that you raised, or it sounds like your friends and acquaintances raised, that is, well, how could this happen? What's so interesting about this case is that, you know, we act so shocked that she could do this, but in fact, the reason that she could do it is because we have a one-drop rule in the United States, where we have a long history of accepting as Black pretty much everybody who, you know, who could look any kind of way, as long as there's a rumor or suspicion or some claim that they have Black ancestry. So we've always had this super capacious, expansive, inclusive notion of Blackness, which made it possible for someone like her for a very long time to be accepted as a Black person. One other thing too that has come up, people often say, well, you said again, some friends said, well, I could never do that. You know, I could never just say I was this race and have that be accepted. I mean, for starters, she wasn't quite accepted. So when it came to light, it's not that she quite had the free pass to do it. But also, we have in our history too a long story of passing, right? Racial passing has a long presence in our national story, and not just on the part of Black people passing as white, even though that's sort of the iconic case that we're most familiar with. But passing has happened in all kinds of different constellations, and certainly we can think of white people posing as Indigenous Americans, we can think of Black people posing as South Asian Indians or Filipinos or Cubans. We've had a whole history of this, and that kind of passing it's never really been wide open to anybody, right? There are a class of people that we think of as racially ambiguous, and other people we think are not racially ambiguous, sorry. So passing that kind of transracialism has never been just something that anybody can do. It's always been restricted, but it's not actually been limited, as some people think, to a matter of white privilege, because frankly, most of the passers in our nation's history haven't been white people. So thank you for that comment and allowing me to share some ideas. I had someone waiting here with a question.
Thank you so much for your talk.
Thank you.
I was really struck by your closing note about the socialization into racial conception, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts or any examples you have of the sort of 17% of people who have the social constructivist view. Like, what would it look like to talk to children in that way? Like, what would be a story we might tell? I'm also still sorting through where the difference is between a social constructivist children's story and a cultural children's story. I'm thinking of like these children from around the world kind of racialization books, also mid-century. But I think my focused question is, what would it look like to tell children that story of social constructivism?
Right. That's such a great question. Thank you. And I have to say, as myself, the mother of two daughters, you know, that's something that I've struggled with. Although you would be surprised at how often I just kind of turn off my my professor lens when I'm at home. And so you know what? The way I try to get young people to think about it is this: to say, you know, when we use categories like white or black, to remind young people, to let them know that these are like a shorthand that we've come up with, this way that we use to label people, but that it doesn't really reflect something about their physical makeup, because it's not as if, again, human beings come in like 3 or 4 flavors, like the yellow, black, white, red taxonomies of the 18th century, right? It's just not a good description of our variety as a species. So I try to let people know that this is really just like a shortcut, a way of trying to describe people. It's not actually a really good way of doing it, but because we're used to calling people that way, that we start to attach all these meanings and start to convince ourselves that people in these different color-coded categories are very different from each other. Now, how would that be different from a story of a cultural concept of race? So the cultural concept of race is one where we argue that, yes, there are these groups of people. These are real groups that really are different from each other. It's just that instead of saying they're different from each other because of the way they look or their genes or their blood, what makes them different from each other are the ways in which they practice culture. So the foods they eat, the ways they dress, the religions they observe, and so forth. So in a sense, the real difference between a culturalist and a constructivist notion of race is that the culturalist notion of race still relies on the idea that our groupings are objective, that they're good measures of actual, you know, difference or similarity between people, and that they depend on our characteristics as individuals. Whereas the constructivist view really insists on how we don't necessarily actually have to be very similar to each other to be put into groups. And that takes me actually to one other way. This is where, again, the one-drop rule in the United States is very informative, right? We have a custom in the United States, the one-drop rule, which is really odd. It's not shared worldwide. It's really anchored in our experiences of slavery and segregation. And it is the idea, of course, that if you have one drop of black blood, you are a black person. Now, we know that this doesn't make any sense from a genetic point of view, right? We know that it's not as if babies get all their genetic material from one parent, from the parent who happens to be black, right? It just doesn't work that way. We all know that. And yet we abide by that social rule. We live with it every day, and we act as if it makes sense, as if it's the most logical thing in the world. So that's more of an argument, I think, for adults probably, but it's one which, again, gets us thinking about how we live by social rules for classifying people that can have very little to do with who actually is most like whom. I'll leave it at that, but thank you for the question. Just time for one more question. Okay, I will take the question here.
Okay. Yeah, so
Sorry
it's
about
like two small questions, so I hope it's fine. But first, I really like how you use the color gradient thing to like
Yeah.
divide and classify. It really reminds
Yeah,
me of like Derrida work on difference and how, you know, like putting on names, you will always miss
Yeah.
something there. So I really like how to use that. And like first, like my first real small question is, how do you, I don't want to use the word feel, but what do you think about like naming people like of like, you know, like underrepresented races like as racialized people? Like that's something I personally do. Like instead of being like, oh, race is your thing, you choose like racialized, because I feel like it fits better the is a concept that it's like an idea that it's set upon you. Oh, sorry, instead of you being something. And the second is, so when you were talking about the transracial situation, of course, like you mentioned that, you know, like the main reason why people were angry possibly was because it's kind of betraying the social construction and the social rules. And I'm gonna connect this with, of course, like the transgender case. And even though, of course, like I'm not gonna go to the extent of being like, oh, it's completely socially acceptable, there is an extent to is more acceptable nowadays. Maybe not in the past, but nowadays. So I think my question is, what makes these two trans identities different, and why might the American people feel more betrayed by a transracial situation than a transgender situation? So yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sure. Okay, I will try to repeat the questions.
Okay.
Or do you want to sum it up very quickly?
Oh yeah,
again?
yeah.
Yes,
Sorry,
go
very
ahead.
quickly, very quickly. One, what do you think of using the word racialized? And the second is, why nowadays, like the whole idea of a transracial identity, it might be more problematic than the idea of a transgender identities. Like of course, like from the social perspective. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for your questions. So to start first with racialized groups, so I think actually, I think the label racialized groups is great because it does, make clear that these groups are produced, that we make them, so I'm all in favor of them. I don't, because I focus on concepts of race, I don't use racialization so much in that I'm looking for what people think race is as a system of classification. But I think that talking about groups or labeling them as racialist groups make a lot of sense. And in fact, I note that in Europe, so I did this research in Italy and elsewhere in Western Europe, like Italy, to talk about race is like just so offensive to people. That's why our book is called An Ugly Word, because when we interviewed people in Italy about race, we often got this reaction from people saying, che brutta parola, which means what an ugly word, just, So, and yet, Europeans instead are more comfortable with the language of racialization, I think, for those reasons. So I think it's a great use. The question about why the uproar about transracial identities and not about transgender in the same way, at least at that moment in time, right? And some of you may remember that just about the time that the Rachel Dolezal story broke was the same time in which Caitlyn Jenner appeared on the cover of Vanity Fair, I think. So, we could say kind of a level of social acceptance that certainly Rachel Dolezal was not getting. I have to tell you quite honestly that I do not have a good answer for you. There's a book written on this question by a sociologist named Rogers Brubaker called Trans, in which he tries to ask this question of why did transgender seem to be accepted and transracial not? I have to tell you, like, quite honestly, I'm not sure I totally have found in that book what the difference is, except to say that that I think it's interesting. I hesitate to say this in where I have many colleagues here from gender studies who will no doubt have more sophisticated ways of thinking about this than me. But I suspect that the frequent conflation between matters of gender and sexuality in the United States meant that ways in which Americans in recent years had wanted to be, let's say, more flexible or open-minded or progressive, whatever we want to call it, with respect to sexual identities, right, led them to also think that to be on the right side of history in a way was also to be open to transgender identities. That's a speculative assumption. Conversely, ideas about race still are getting lots of biological notions of race still got lots of airtime, lots of attention, lots of support in our society. And so race seems more like the natural order of things, possibly. So to go against that, again, seemed just like pure craziness to many people. So I'm sorry, it's a sort of a temporary answer, a stopgap answer for you, but that's off the top of my head. Thank you. I suggest, thank you. I can actually time to take, can I take 2 more questions? Great, okay. Please, thank you.
Hi. So I have a friend that I've debated with quite a bit who uses the idea that race is a concept as an argument. Can you take your okay. I have a friend I've debated with quite a bit who uses the idea that race is a concept as an argument against affirmative action. Basically, he's saying that, look, humans have invented these racial categories. There's nothing that really backs them up. So how can we give some groups a leg up based on this, you know, this fiction of race? And so I'd love to hear what your response to that would be.
Sure. So this is actually, this idea that race is not biologically real, which is sort of what social constructivism maintains, is sometimes taken or misinterpreted to mean that we're saying race is not real. But race is real socially. It's socially real, right? Lots of things are real without being biologically real, right? Religious groupings, for example, are not dictated by our DNA, but they are socially very real categories. These are categories, right, that people live and die by. So that argument that you're trying to elide the difference between saying that race is not biologically real and then suggesting that it is not socially real, I think is what's the operation there to try to delegitimize attention to race as the social force that it is, right? Because affirmative action at the end of the day is trying to grapple with race as a social force, as a social reality, and it indubitably has that reality in our society.
Hi, yeah, sorry, yeah, I can remove my mask. Hi, thank you. So as a transracial adoptee myself, I appreciate the nod to that community and that identity, as well as some of that. And I think specifically for me, some of my experiences as a international and transracial, like Asian adoptee to white parents or Caucasian parents, the feeling that your argument for constructivism is really resonates with me. I think particularly because of the feeling for me, particularly race was always something that was very much like something arbitrarily imposed, that may be the way I would say it. But then particularly going back to then how transracial maybe adoptees and people of those identities feel about being people who identify as transracial. I think a lot now about the more contemporary maybe example of like Ollie London, who I know is someone who is European descent, who's white, who's gone to great lengths to assert that they are transracially Korean now, and they've done that in the way of eyelid surgery, for example. So there's been a physical, like a biological, in a way, like a physical alteration of characteristics, and on top of that, the adoption or appropriation, some would argue, of like Korean and Asian culture. And so I guess kind of with your 3 categorization of those notions of, you know, is race on the biological basis and the outward presentation, is it on the cultural, or is it on the social constructivist, I would say maybe someone like Ollie London is checking 2 out of those 3 boxes, but remains socially unaccepted as Korean or Asian, particularly by other people who are in fact Korean and Asian. So in that sense, I think, I don't know, that just made that case particularly for me, made me feel like that if anything else backs up that sense of you can have maybe, you know, all of those things, but regardless, you're not accepted as being, you know, transracial, and in that sense. So yeah, thank you.
Right. Yeah, thank you so much, because I don't know Ollie London. I've never heard of Ollie London, so I'm grateful that you're bringing this to my attention, because I'm actually keeping a list of individuals whose racial identities have been contested in public spaces, because as much as we think of racial dolezal as just this sort of one, you know, freak of nature, I have a list, I think now I'm going on like 40 people or something, who in different ways their racial identities have been debated or contested. They make one claim in the public, people disagree. It goes back to, for example, we can think of like jazz musicians from the early part of the 20th century who might have been like Italian or Jewish, married black women, were accepted and understood themselves as black. So there's a long history of people making these claims and these claims being contested. But I'm also really grateful to you for this comment because it allows me actually to talk very briefly about another area of my research which actually stemmed out of the Rachel Dolezal case, and it has to do with what I call cases of racial contestation. What the study of these sort of individuals has showed me is that I think we're in a moment in the United States where our social rules actually about how one is a legitimate member of a racial group are changing. So Dolezal was sort of pressing the frontier of saying that you can be transrace. If you feel, or maybe like Ollie London, you feel like you're a member of this race, that's a legitimate claim, right? So that is one way in which some people are pushing the boundaries of how we should think about race. Another way, though, that people have been pushing the boundaries is through cosmetic surgery, right? This idea, there's a sociologist at Yale named Alka Menon who's written about what she calls ethnic reassignment surgery and the capacities that surgeons have today to basically make us into whatever we want to be, apparently. Is this something that is going to be, some people are claiming that because they've had a certain surgery that they now are bona fide members of other racial groups. And then finally, I also want to mention one other way in which we are rethinking who can be the members of racial groups, and that is through genetic genealogy tests. So the idea that people go and get DNA tests that say, oh, you are part this, and then you're like, oh, now I am a card-carrying member of race X, that's a claim which is also actually getting some traction, probably more traction than any of these other claims. You have people going to court saying, I got this DNA test showing that I'm part Sub-Saharan African, I'm part, Native American, I should be entitled to this, I should be accepted in this group. So that's also kind of a work in progress. And I think all of these things speak to ways in which, as a nation, we want to be more respectful of people's subjective self-identities, right? And again, this is linking back also to the transgender claims. We want to, in some sense, respect people's claims of membership, but we're not quite sure yet which claims we're going to accept based on which kinds of evidence. So thank you for bringing that up. And I'm going to look up Ollie London now. Right. Hi.
Hello, Professor. Hi. Well, I'm just nervous just standing up here, so I don't know how you did that for a whole hour. So today we spoke a lot about how the American society tried to draw different lines in different parts of history to divide us. So I wanted to do the reverse and ask you the opposite. What, from your perspective, does it mean to be an American?
Wow. So my answer to that, it's actually very much conditioned by the research that I've done in Europe. In a lot of European countries, what makes you a member of the national society, it has to do with your blood, right? So Italy is a good case. In Italy, if you're born in Italy, speak fluent Italian, did all your schooling in Italy, you are still not Italian automatically, right? They're following the jus sanguinis, or law of blood rules, as opposed to the sort of law of the land, of the soil that we follow in the US, whereby people born in the US are automatically US citizens. So I think as an American, I share very much I say maybe as an American, maybe also especially as a New Yorker, because it's been such a magnet city for immigration, I tend to think of Americans as basically people who are here, who have spent some considerable amount of time here, regardless of citizenship status. Simply because I see, actually in Europe as well as here, what sponges we are culturally for adopting both sort of local, traditions, cultures, people fit in, but also I think in our cities and different parts of the country, we also see how if there's a presumption that people can be part of the national society, regardless of which language they speak or what food they eat at home, then they effectively are members of that. The only thing that's preventing people from being Americans, or Italians for that matter, is the acceptance of the larger society around them. And in comparing the US and Western Europe, I see very starkly the differences between a society where the presumption is you can be an American, really doesn't matter what you look like or where you're from, versus societies, again, like Italy, where there's no kind of concept in Italy for you, like that you could be a Black American, I'm sorry, a Black Italian, an Afro-Italian, an Asian Italian. It just doesn't compute in a way. So clearly, as an American, I sort of take this more expansive view of what it is to be American.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And also, what does it mean to be a New Yorker?
Ah, well, no, don't get me started, right? Exactly. No, I don't want to ruin my talk on that note with letting my New York chauvinism come through, so thank you. Sure. Yes? Okay.
Hi, thank you also for the talk and all the amazing different thoughts that we have to consider now. I want to go back to what you mentioned about the one-drop constriction that often throughout history has defined Black people, or in like Latin American culture. I'm Mexican American myself, and we think of it as mejorando la raza, which is like improving the race by making it whiter. And I just kind of want to touch on how that goes in contrast to Rachel Dolezal, then again, not to continue this, but and how she has been allowed and given the space to self-identify, and same with this the British Ollie person. I looked them up, and they're also white. So, and I wanted to ask, how does white fragility fit into this story where Rachel Dolezal decided that she likes Black culture better, so now she's a Black person. And so, yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to know.
Sure, thank you. All right, I hope I can do that, do justice to that. So I guess the first thing I would say is that it's actually not clear to me that Rachel Dolezal was allowed to identify as Black. I mean, yes, she's lived her life in a certain way, but once it became public knowledge that she was born to white parents, then I would say pretty definitively she was not quite given a free pass to identify as Black. It's been hardly, it hasn't been smooth sailing. And actually, for that reason, it's especially interesting that, to my knowledge, she's really stuck with it. So unlike other cases that we've seen in recent years, particularly of white women who have claimed some identity of color as Black or Latina women, in a couple of these cases, when they've been found out, they've recanted, you could say. They've stepped back and said, I'm sorry, I was being disingenuous, I was lying, I was fraudulent. That's not where she's coming from. That's not how she's thinking about it. And so to me, there's a really interesting question, and this is something that I'd actually like to think about more and write about in future, but is to ask not so much the question of whether white people or white women are being allowed to cross the boundaries in this way, because I'm saying right now they're not really, honestly, for now. They may in the future. But more importantly, I'm interested in asking the question of why. Why cross those boundaries, right? When we think about historical passing, it's pretty straightforward. We can understand why Black people who could pass themselves off as white or maybe Mexican or Filipino or Cuban or Indian or all the kinds of things that they pass themselves off as, we can understand why, given the racial strictures of the era. But today it's an interesting question. Why would white people prefer? What would they gain? Again, in cases, like Rachel Dolezal's case, I don't think it's a straightforward case. I mean, there have been cases where there's clear material gain, like the Malone brothers who in the 1970s wanted to be in Boston, I think it was Boston's fire department, and on their test they said they were Black, but they weren't really, and they got a leg up in the point system. That's one story, but that's not her story, and I would argue that's actually not the common story that we're seeing today, that we're seeing people attracted to crossing racial boundaries out of something else. There's some other kind of gain, a psychological gain of some sort. And I think it's also telling that we see women disproportionately engaging in this. I mean, again, we're talking about small numbers. We don't have like random samples of people doing this, so I have to be really cautious about jumping to conclusions. But I will say that it seems as if there is something for white women where taking on another racial persona offers a kind of liberty, that a latitude that they may not feel they have as white women. it's interesting, like some of these other women who have come to light recently, like I think at Georgetown, George Washington, I can't remember, seem to have taken advantage of their persona as Latinas, Black women, to act in ways, basically to act in assertive ways, right? To act out stereotypes about Black women as assertive and aggressive and angry or whatever. But it's telling that they felt that they had to do that as members of another race, that somehow as white women they weren't entitled to those behaviors. So I think that there are a lot of very interesting questions about how these forms of race crossing are taking place, but we really have yet to have, I think, a very definitive and a very rigorous empirical examination of that. Like, I think we're just really in the beginning of stages of even being willing to countenance this possibility and take a good look at it rather than just like condemn it.
Hi, so I am a student of racial linguistics, which is the body of work that kind of studies sort of how does language influence how you're perceived and your racial identity is perceived. And sort of mostly the work that I did for this was actually in New York. It was in 1281 Fulton Street, which was a Walgreens in Brooklyn. One of the most diverse places on earth, also one of the most linguistically interesting places on earth, where how you said a specific utterance, what references you made, and sort of all of that could really change. For example, in a paper that I'm trying to send out to conferences, I'm talking about how just having a New Yorker tote bag, right, can signal in that neighborhood, are you the gentrifier or are you the gentrified? So I'm doing this racial linguistics work, but I wanted to ask you about sort of some of the anxieties that I feel doing this kind of work, because obviously appropriation is a really major concern. And affirmative action, how it's been contested, is also a really major concern. So how does one do a kind of work like this, where obviously I have to talk about my own sense of racial ambiguity and the different ways that I was perceived, without drawing attention away from the very structural and material aspects of race, as it is a lived reality in America. So it's a construct, but also kind of a lived reality. And how does one sort of work with that?
Yes. If I can just ask a follow-up question. So are you asking how to deal with it as a researcher who's interacting with other people, and so you don't want to sort of bias what they might say, or are you talking more about how you present your work, let's say, how you write it up and report it? I'm not quite sure what.
I think more so how you sort of pitch it in an economy where other people are also pitching the same work, and not try to draw attention away from sort of people who are living those lived realities in a more sort of vivid way than me.
Right, right. I mean, I think whenever we do research on race, there are a couple of pitfalls to it, we could say. So one is the sort of social desirability effect, so that you're interacting with people, and maybe because the topic is sensitive, they just say the things they think you want to hear, or they're afraid that they might offend you on the basis of whatever group they think you're a member of. So I think there are a lot of things to be cognizant of. But it sounds to me like what you're talking about is really the importance in your work of putting the people that you're studying sort of front and center, and sort of trying to incorporate their worldviews and make those really speak, as opposed to just your own interpretations, imposing them on them. So it sounds to me like you're talking about a really careful balancing act as a research of both asserting your authorial voice, your social scientific voice, your ideas, your hypotheses, but at the same time showing a great deal of respect and deference to what people are telling you about their experiences of their lived experiences. So I hope that's helpful. I think it's kind of a big topic we could talk about for a long time.
Thank you so much.
But yeah, thank you. Great. What do I think? Great.
I think that's it for tonight. So can you join me in thanking Dr. Morning for...
Great. Thank you. Thank you.